So I'd like to introduce George. George is coming from Israel, straight off the plane. Did you make any stops in between?
Yeah.
Some stops in between. Used to live here in Vancouver and work at Temple Shalom as a youth director. And also is very involved with the B'nai Dror. This summer he spent in Israel, in the IDF, and he's going to share his story with us. So, take it away,
Cool.
George.
Thank you, Rotem. So I'm going to have a little slideshow playing in the background, and hopefully that won't dominate things or distract things, but mainly a few slides of text, mainly just pictures. Also, I'd like to say before I begin that I have now lived in Israel for a little over 3 years, and I'd like to conduct this talk in the Israeli fashion rather than in the Canadian fashion. And if at any point someone wants to interrupt me to tell me that I'm wrong or disagree with me or ask me a question, that they should feel free to do so, because that's what I'm accustomed to.
Should we do that before you start?
Yeah. You should also feel free to do it before I've even begun. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who this talk will go in 3 places, just so you know beforehand what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and my background and why I live in Israel and a little bit of what I do in Israel. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the IDF and some of my personal reasons for joining the IDF, in addition to it being an obligation. And then I'm going to talk about this summer and what happened in the Gaza conflict and my personal experience and some of my personal thoughts on that. I'm going to represent my own point of view, which you can feel free to disagree with or ask questions about. And the standard, I'm going to tell my narrative, which is, just so you guys are clear from the beginning, and it is Israeli-centric narrative. I'm not going to equally tell the Palestinian narrative because I'm not Palestinian. I'm going to tell a narrative that I think is moral and has ethical questions to it and that is intellectually honest, but it is an Israeli narrative. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I wrote some notes in case I forgot who I was. So I grew up in Philadelphia at a conservative synagogue and a B'nai Dror summer camp out there, and I was involved in the Jewish community, visited Israel a lot. When I was 18, I did a gap year in Israel that changed my life. It was really awesome. And then I came back to the States and I went to Stanford in California, but I didn't like it, so I came here to UBC for a year. But I also didn't like it here, so I went back to Stanford and I graduated. And then I moved back here and I lived in Vancouver in the Habonim Bayit, the house with the Habonim people in the city. And I worked at Temple Shalom, I worked at Or Shalom. I went to some events at Hillel. I was working in Habonim activities year-round. I was really involved in the Jewish community too. At the end of that year, me and many of my best friends decided that we wanted to move to Israel to help start an urban kibbutz in Haifa, where we live communally. I live in a small group with 9 people that's part of a larger urban kibbutz of 40 or 50 people. And as part of this, like I said, we live communally, so that means we have one giant apartment for all 9 of us. We have one kitchen for all 9 of us. We share all our money. We make decisions together 1 night a week. We learn together. We celebrate Shabbat together every week. And that's my personal life in a nutshell. This is the 9 people that I live with. This is us in the Baha'i Gardens in Haifa. This is us cooking dinner. This is the center of household life.
Are they all Olim Chadashim?
They are all Olim Chadashim from the U.S. and Canada. In the urban kibbutz, there's people from the U.S., Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, England, and Israel. So we have a wide swath of countries among the 50 of us. The people I live with specifically are all from the U.S. and Canada. And we cook for all 9 of us every night, so it looks like a bit of a balagan before anything ever gets started, but that's how we do things. And this is my larger urban kibbutz at a Yom Ha'atzmaut party. Every Jewish holiday and every Israeli holiday, all 40 or 50 of us get together to do something to celebrate it together. So every Pesach, we write our own Haggadah, and we celebrate it that way. And every Yom Ha'atzmaut, we go on one of our friends' rooftops, and we have a giant barbecue, and we read the Declaration of Independence together. And this is my communal life in a nutshell.
How many urban kibbutzim are there in Israel?
Probably, I guess, around 30. something like that.
Spread
In
around
most, yeah, from Mitzpeh Ramon up to Kiryat Shmona. So pretty much everywhere besides Eilat. No one's yet ventured down there. No one's been brave enough. So, essentially the point of the urban kibbutz that we built, in addition to creating a life that we, meaningful Jewish life and communal life that we live in and enjoy and are proud of, was to make a change in Israeli society. We do a lot of projects. Some of them are coexistence projects with Arab Israelis. Some of them are working with at-risk youth. Some of us work at a school in Carmiel that has a lot of, that's designed for many at-risk youth, specifically from the Ethiopian sector, but not only. We live in a rough neighborhood. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Haifa. Almost everyone here has been to Haifa. Raise your hand if you know the Hadar neighborhood of Haifa. So that is where we live. It's a neighborhood that in the 1940s was the creme de la creme of Haifa, but has slowly declined. And since the Soviet Union immigration, the big Soviet Union immigration in the early 90s, is pretty much the worst neighborhood in Haifa, with a lot of poverty, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of single-family households, and almost everyone there that has a bright future that grows up there tries to leave. And we decided as young people, almost all of whom could, succeed financially and career-wise, and almost all of whom have university degrees, that we wanted to come into the neighborhood and make it a better neighborhood. And specifically, some of us work in the neighborhood running an after-school program for kids, almost all of whom have really tough backgrounds, and live with just one family, with one parent at home, and live in poverty, or near the poverty line. So that's the type of stuff we came to do. We wrote a letter to the youth movement we grew up in when we made Aliyah, saying, we're coming to Israel to help strengthen Israeli democracy, to help achieve social justice, to help promote a peace process with the Palestinians. And in a nutshell, we're socialists, we're Zionists, and we're left-wing, and we're supporters of peace. So before I go on, I want to ask you guys, why, as someone who likes social justice and peace and coexistence and all those things that I just said, and socialism and all that, why do you think I would serve in the IDF?
Because it's right.
Can you expand on that?
That you can be in favor of peace and still want to defend your country. And there are different ways of defending your country, not necessarily just killing terrorists.
You want to say what do you mean?
Yeah, same. I mean, you have to defend your country, and it's the right decision. Ben?
Yeah.
Maybe it was more of a cultural thing, of like you wanted to be a part of something that a lot of people in your age have been a part of, and you would want to immerse yourself in that cultural aspect?
Definitely. Yeah. So, Rabbi?
I'd like to say, to break this cycle of thought, that if you're left of center, this is what you're for in terms of rights for women, for gays, for children, for people. But it appears that if you're left of center in the world today, you're also automatically knee-jerk anti-Israel. That's a philosophy that's out there, it seems, that if you're part of a group that's left of center, you somehow have to buy into this anti-Israel stuff as well. And this breaks that thought that you're not an automaton. You have your thoughts, and you can be very pro-Israel, you can be critical. You can be right of center and be critical of Israel. It's showing that one thing has nothing to do with the other. It's just that it seems that that agenda has been hijacked by the left of center groups, many left of center groups.
So I think we'll delve a little bit more into that later, the political discussion. That's going to kind of be the focus of the end of this this talk. But I'm going to try and present to you a little bit about the IDF right now and a little bit how it was established and how it works. And it's also important for me to say before, I'm going to explain my personal story. But I did, in the regular army I did 6 months. I didn't do 3 years, I only did 6 months. And I was a truck driver, I was not a combat soldier. And I'm not, one, I'm not a spokesperson of the IDF. And two, I'm not, even if I was trying to be, I would not be the best because I can't represent the tons of experience or the combat experience type of thing. So if you're expecting me to be either the biggest war hero or biggest war criminal in history, you are going to be disappointed by the rest of my talk. So just so I'm clear from the get-go. I'm going to talk a little bit about Saha, the IDF now. So first of all, the IDF is structured on the model of a people's army, and everyone that does business, everyone that goes through the Israeli army in their basic training, even if you do the worst, shortest, lowest level basic training, which is the one I did, you learn about this model. The two aspects of this are that there's a draft that every single person serves. It's not actually every single person, as you guys all know, but the idea was that every single person would serve, men and women. They originally wanted religious and secular, and they almost made it Jews as well as Arabs in the beginning. That plan got nixed, as you probably all know. And the bulk, most Israeli soldiers, we'll talk a little bit about this more, but most Israeli soldiers are not people that put on uniforms every day. Most Israeli soldiers are people that look like me, that can have full head of hair and don't have to shave and wear whatever they want, and that they're these things called reservist soldiers, which is very different from the Canadian or American model. Before I dive into the reservist bit, who here speaks French properly? Can someone pronounce that name? For me, there's supposed to be a little thing over the E in the last name.
Jean Jaurès.
Jean Jaurès? Okay, so I'm a Canadian citizen, but not a native-born Canadian, and I will butcher any French word that I try and pronounce. But this is the man who was a French politician in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He invented the idea of the People's Army. He was a socialist politician. And I recommend that if you are a young university student interested in social justice, you look up this guy and learn more about him, because he was a politician for many years, and he was actually a great human being, and has a lot to teach us. When the Dreyfus affair broke out in France, and a French military officer was accused of treason, and crowds outside chanted death to the Jews, and most people in France thought that the Jews were not loyal citizens. He didn't go along with the crowd, and he said this is anti-Semitic and this is bullshit, and we shouldn't accuse him. When people in the socialist movement decided we should do a communist revolution and bloodily overthrow everyone and kill all the bourgeois and the leaders of the government, he said, no, that's stupid, that's not a humane solution. When everyone in France and in Germany and in all the countries like that got in the spirit of World War I and thought, this is the war, we're the French, we need to kill all the Germans, or we're the Germans, we need to kill all the French. He was one of the few people in Europe very actively, that was a significant political leader, very actively trying to prevent the war, and realized this is a stupid war that's going to kill millions of people and accomplish absolutely nothing. All the dominant trends of French and European political culture in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's the path of justice and the path of stupidity, and he almost always went the path of justice. And anyways, he's a very interesting guy, and he, unlike many leftists today, thought a lot about militaries and military policy. And he said, we need to create a new type of army. Instead of having, at that point in France, everyone had to serve 2 years in the army, and it wasted a ton of money that he thought could have been spent on social welfare. And he made it so that the army was completely separated from civilian life, and he said people should do a very short service that trains them, and then serve in the reserves for 20 years, something like that. That way, he talked about a barracks subculture, that when you're on an army base, all you do is train for war, and all you think about is war and army and military, and you don't interact with civilian society, and you're actually bored if you're not fighting a war, because all you're trained to do is war. And he said that that's a bad system. We should have the soldiers be people who are civilians who don't want to go to war, who aren't sitting around waiting for wars. and that is a better way to make a military, and it's a better way to make a socialist state because we can spend a lot more money on education and poverty and things like that. So he came up with this model. He wrote a whole manifesto describing it, and he actually proposed it to be a set of laws in France. Didn't quite work. And when World War II was breaking out, Germany and Russia had declared war on each other, and France had a secret allyship with Russia. So France had to join Russia against Germany, and the government was in the process of in the next few weeks deciding whether they were going to join the war against Germany and whether World War I was going to happen or not, essentially. He went to Germany. He was the leader of the French Socialist Party, and he went to Germany, met with the leaders of the labor unions there, and said, if this war happens, every single worker in Germany and every single worker in France, not Russia, needs to go on strike. If we can't build any uniforms or bullets or guns or more cars or tanks or anything like that, the war can't happen, and we can prevent this war. And this war is going to be a stupid madness that's going to kill millions of people and accomplish nothing. And the German labor union leader agreed with him, and they were going to try and implement their plans. When he got back to France, nationalist extremists assassinated him, and World War I broke out. So his life is tragic, but he had a bunch of good ideas. I gave a really long plug for him. But he came up with the model of the People's Army, that the army belongs to the people, to the nation, and is not totally separated from society. In Israel, for every active soldier, like I said, there's 3 reservist soldiers. Sorry about that. And in Canada, do you guys have any idea what the figure is? How many active soldiers there are for every reservist soldier? Or the United States? In both the United States and Canada, it's roughly 2 active soldiers for every 1 reservist soldier. So for every 3 people in the Canadian military manpower system, there's 2 people that wear a uniform every day and 1 person that's a civilian for most of their life. In Israel, it's the opposite. There's 3 civilians that are militarily trained and can be called to service for every 1 person that puts on the uniform. So this has a twofold tension. Have you guys ever seen Jews with semi-automatic rifles? Where have you seen Jews with semi-automatic rifles?
Board meeting.
Board meetings? Yeah. Hillel board, it's just typical thing to bring.
Synagogue board meeting.
Where have you guys seen Jews with semi-automatic rifles? Israel. And that's the first thing you think when you get off a plane for the first time. If you have never been to Israel before, it's like, who knew Jews could have such big guns? Jews in Canada and America don't have guns this big. In America, plenty of people do, but it's not really the Jews. And you see this and you think the society is much more militarized, which it is. It's undeniable. Israeli society is much more militarized than North American society. The other side of that is every Israeli soldier, even combat soldiers in dangerous positions, pretty much maximum every 3 weeks are allowed to go home and see their family. And there's a saying in the IDF or in Israeli society, I don't know where I heard it, but there's only so evil you can be when you go home every 2 or 3 weeks and see your grandma, and see your mom, and see your nieces and nephews and all those people. If all you interact with is other soldiers with guns trying to prove how macho they are, trying to be a badass, fighting wars and policing checkpoints and things like that, you can become more of a... It led you to get completely taken over by a military mindset. But the fact is, you're much more integrated with civilian life while you're a soldier in the Israeli army. Unlike in the Canadian or American army, where you go to a base, which is you get trained on a base on the other side of the country. You see your family every 6 months or a year, and then if a war happens, you get sent over to Asia, to Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that, and you see your family once every year or 2, and you're completely disconnected from civilian life. So this is the 2 sides of the coin. Does that make sense? So this is why Jean, the French guy, he wrote an introduction to why he believed in a people's army. It is imperative, both for socialism and for the nation, to define what the military institutions and the external policy of Republican France should be. In order to hasten to accomplish its evolution towards entire social justice, to inaugurate or even to prepare a new order in which labor shall be organized and supreme. That means socialism will win and the workers will rule society. France needs, above all else, peace and security. We must not allow her to be tempted into the sinister diversion of foreign adventures. On the other hand, we must protect her from the threat of foreign violence. So what's he saying here? Jean. What's Jean saying?
Don't do military campaigns of conquest and just protect our borders.
Yeah. Also, that you can't define society if you're not willing to define the military institutions. You can't look to lead society if you're not willing to deal with military matters. That's one part of it. And two, you should structure the military in such a way that, one, it can defend itself. That's the second part, because if you can't defend yourself, if France didn't have an army, they would have been beaten by Germany in a week, rather than holding off for 4 years, which is what they did in World War I. But on the other hand, you want to structure the military in a way that you don't get tempted into sinister foreign adventures. You don't start stupid wars that are unnecessary. You don't colonize other people. You don't use your army to do evil things. And he was against colonialism at a time when very few Europeans were. So he wrote a book about restructuring the army, and he wrote it to the workers of France, because if you're a socialist in the 19-teens, you have to give a shout out to the workers. But also he wrote it to military officers. He wrote a book as a socialist leader, and military officers generally aren't known for their socialist tendencies, but he wrote a book to try and convince military officers that this is the way the French army should be structured. I want to talk a little bit about the army's relationship with the left. Today, armies aren't very popular on the left. Do people agree, disagree? Is this a generally accepted thing? Yeah. The left isn't super into armies. And I'm not sure whether this is in the West or in North America specifically, but since Vietnam, the left, the very vocal, self-identifying left, has opposed almost all military interventions. And sometimes this has been really great, like the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think was completely stupid and based on false pretenses and led to a lot of people dying and didn't help create stability in Iraq. And the left opposed that, and I think that was good. On the other hand, sometimes when people have advocated interventions in genocides and human rights violations, the left also opposes it. The left, especially any American military intervention, the left has a strong feeling that any military intervention must be from colonialist, stupid, manipulated purposes. Which, on the one hand, it's good that the left didn't get sucked up into the madness of Iraq in 2003. That's my personal take on what happened in 2003. But on the other hand, when a genocide happens, or when there's a massive human rights violation or a massive threat to world peace, you do need to use the military. And generally, the left's stance has been opposed to almost all sorts of military interventions. Sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst. And I'll say, just because I'm a socialist and I'm a leftist and I like to complain about the left sometimes, that the left has a murky relationship with power. My personal take on the world, and a lot of leftists in Israel and a lot of leftists here, is that in general we prefer to criticize those that are in power rather than try and assume power, rather than try and act responsibly and take over things and run the world in a different and more just way. I think we generally like to criticize those in power, and that especially applies to the military. So, the draft system in Israel, like I said, it makes a more militarized society. That's undeniable. On the other hand, there's a sense of equality and social solidarity that the military produces in Israel that are completely non-existent in North America, and I think in most Western countries. I'll say that when I was serving, first of all, when you serve, everyone wears the same uniform. You guys seen the uniforms. And you really don't know where someone comes from and exactly how old they are and how much money they have and what ethnic group in Israel they came from and where their grandparents used to live and things like that. You have no idea. Everyone looks exactly the same and feels the same, which is, on the one hand, oppressive and not fun that you can't choose what cool pants you get to wear every day. But on the other hand, it does create a genuine sense of equality. And for me, the people that I served with came from a much tougher socioeconomic backgrounds than me. They were almost all Russian immigrants, Ethiopian immigrants, Druze and Bedouin who came from Arab villages that were not particularly well funded, and they had a very low financial future, and almost none of them will ever even attend university, much less graduate. And I was fully equal in every way as a straight, white, upper middle class American male to all these people that were much younger than me, that were much less educated than me, that had much less opportunities in life. In the Army, for the first time in my life, all the privileges I've been given by God or by society or whatever were sucked out from under me. And that was for the best, I think. Even though at times I didn't like being a 25-year-old serving with 18-year-old ruffians. That was the opportunity in my life where I'll say I had the least privilege. And I think that's something important to think about. And lastly, before I jump into my personal experience, I'll say about Israel that it's in a unique position. This guy, Ari Shavit, who's a Haaretz columnist, he just wrote a book called My Promised Land, which a lot of people in the Jewish community are talking about and reading. And in the intro, I forget whether it's the intro or the first chapter, he talks about Israel is in a unique position that no country in the world is in it, and that the left and right each screw up. Israel is occupying other people. I'll summarize his thoughts, which for the most part I agree with, but it's his thoughts. He says, we are occupying other people, the Palestinian people. Our existence prevents them from having independence as a nation, and we put them in a position that we would never accept for ourselves. That's what we're doing to the Palestinians. And that's bad, and the left really likes to talk about this, the right really is uncomfortable talking about it. Also, Israel is threatened with annihilation in a way that no other country in the world is threatened with. Iran has a bunch of is trying to develop nuclear bombs and saying they're committed to Israel's destruction. Hamas says they're committed to Israel's destruction. Hezbollah, ISIS, all these powers around, sometimes militias, sometimes actual state governments, are saying they want to destroy our country. And no other country in the world has that. And Israelis live with this sense of existential fear that people in no other part of the world live with. Even though life in Gaza, for instance, is much worse than life in Israel, and the Gazans feel very bad for themselves, which in many ways they should. We'll talk about that. There's the whole world, and there's not a giant movement saying that Palestinians should never have a state. The Jews and Israel is the only state that people go around denying that and saying that the Jews shouldn't have a state, that Israel shouldn't exist. And there's people actively committed in a military sense to Israel's destruction. And like I said, the left loves talking about occupation, the right, it makes uncomfortable, and annihilation, the right loves talking about how Israel's up against this existential threat, and the left doesn't know how to talk about it so much, it makes them uncomfortable. And he says anyone that wants to deal with Israel and the Middle East in a complicated, nuanced way needs to deal with both of these facts, or else they're lying to themselves. And if you're from the right, you need to think a lot more and talk a lot more about the occupation, and if you're from the left, you need to think a lot more and talk a lot more about the existential threat of annihilation that Israel faces. So that's the concluding thoughts. Now I'm going to get into my personal experience. That's me. On my first day in the IDF, I was still pretty uncomfortable wearing my uniform. Also, they didn't give me the right size, so that's no big deal. I made Aliyah just before my 24th birthday. When you make Aliyah and you are 23 years old, if you're a woman, first of all, you don't have to serve whatsoever. If you're a man, you have to serve for 6 months. So I went in almost exactly a year after I made Aliyah, and at the Bakum, which is the place where every single Israeli that's ever been inducted to the army has gone through, which is really, you really understand how small Israel is when it's like every single person in Israel got their dog tags in this exact room, which isn't that big. Every single like from Benjamin Netanyahu and Shimon Peres on down to me, got their dog tags in this little crappy room. So anyways, I got inducted. They asked me, what do you want to be in the army? And I was like, I don't know, what are my choices? I'm only doing 6 months. And they're like, no, tell me what you want. I was like, I have no idea. Just tell me what my choices are. He's like, no. And then finally I was like, just tell me what my choices are. And the guy was like, okay, I'll be honest. Your choices are you can be a cook or a truck driver. And I was like, okay, so I'll be a truck driver. So I got sent to the truck driving unit, and I did basic training with people that were going to be truck drivers, and then I did a truck driving course for 2 months, then I did advanced truck driving training for a month. And then I became then I was officially a certified truck driver, and I had a month and a half or 2 months left in the army. And then I was like, all right, commanders, give me a truck, I'm ready to drive, whatever. And they were like, no, that's not how it works, George. I was like, why? Did you just train me for a little 4 months to drive a truck? Why am I not driving? They said, well, you only have a month and a half left, and we have to do all this paperwork, and it's not really worth it to us. So for the last month and a half, They mainly tried to convince me to sit around and wait and do nothing and not complain. But in the last 2 weeks, I convinced them that they should really let me drive a truck, and I drove an actual truck. And the missions that I drove, I'll explain every mission that I drove with actual cargo in my truck. I went out of my base, made a left, then made a right to the base across my street, and then I loaded my truck. And that was the heroic / war criminal deeds of the IDF that I had this special advanced training to do. It was very difficult. Not anyone could do it, but I'm a pretty brave person, I like to think. So I was able to pull it off, and yeah. And a little bit more about the soldiers I served with, I guess I'll say. I already mentioned about them. They were all 18, 19. I was 25 when I went into the Army, and they were all from almost all from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I think pretty much all. And on the one hand, it was a really rough base. The bathrooms were the most disgusting things you've ever seen in your life. I don't care what types of porta potties you think you've seen. You've not seen a disgusting bathroom until you've been to this base. And there's quite a few robberies inside the base, and it was pretty rough.
Where was the base?
In Tirana Carmel, just outside of Haifa. It was if I had a car or motorcycle, it's like a 15-minute drive from my house. And that's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, I met people that came from situations that were so much tougher than any person that I'd ever met besides homeless people on the street, like people that I actually had prolonged interactions with over several months. One guy was a Druze guy. Do you know what Druze is? Should I explain what Druze is? Druze is a minority group, a religious ethnic minority that it was an offshoot of Islam 900 years ago. In a nutshell, this guy, when I was in advanced truck driving training, which was just as fun as it sounds, we did training. We had to stand at attention in a ched and get our name, do roll call essentially at 7:10 every morning, and we finished activities at 5 p.m. And then our commanders left, but we had to stay on the base. But they left, so if you were smart, you could also leave. So he left every day. He got in a fight with his parents, hasn't spoken to them for several years, so he lives with his grandmother. His grandmother's sick and can't work and can't support herself and has big medical bills to pay. So he had to work on top of that. And the IDF has a special thing where if you're in a really bad financial situation or family situation, you can get permission to work on top of your Army service, which is very good and an ethical and just thing for an Army to do, in my opinion. But they denied his application, and so he should have gotten off 2 days a week or something like that to work, but they didn't let him do that. So he had to do truck driving from 7 a.m. till 5 p.m. Then he would have to sneak out of the base, and it took 2.5 hours to get home on public transit. So he'd get back to his village around 8. He would work from 8 to midnight, get home at 12:30, wake up at 4 in the morning to be back in the base on time. So he was sleeping 3.5, 4 hours a night, working a half a day after doing 10 hours of truck driving in the Army every day and spending 5 hours on public transit every day. And his life was just pretty much harder than anyone's life that I've ever met. And I spent several months serving with this guy. And at a certain point, I felt really bad for myself because, like I said, these soldiers were really rough and they were a lot less mature than me and kind of annoying to serve with. On the other hand, it was a very humbling. I want to say humiliating, but that's not the right word. What's the right word? Humbling experience. So I did that for 6 months. Like I said, all I did was the left turn, then the right turn. That was my contribution.